There is a moment, often small and easy to dismiss, when your gut quietly tells you something about a person before your mind has gathered enough evidence to explain why. Most people override that feeling. They tell themselves they are overthinking, being too judgmental, or simply imagining problems that do not exist. But psychologists who study trust, deception, and human character have found something fascinating across decades of research. Certain behaviors, when they appear consistently, predict untrustworthiness with startling accuracy, far more reliably than most people realize. These are not rare, dramatic red flags pulled from crime documentaries. They are quiet, ordinary patterns, hiding in plain sight, woven into conversations, relationships, and workplaces everywhere. And once you learn to see them clearly, you may never look at certain people the same way again. The first behavior worth watching closely is inconsistency between words and actions, what psychologists call behavioral incongruence. A person might say all the right things, expressing loyalty, kindness, or good intentions, while their actual behavior tells a completely different story. Someone who claims to value honesty but routinely exaggerates small details, or someone who insists they care about your well-being while consistently prioritizing their own convenience is revealing something important. Human language is remarkably easy to manipulate. Sustained behavior, repeated over time, is far harder to fake, which is exactly why trust should always be built on patterns of action rather than promises spoken in a single conversation. The second behavior is something researchers call selective accountability, the tendency to accept blame only when consequences are unavoidable, while deflecting responsibility whenever there is any room to do so. Trustworthy people tend to acknowledge mistakes proactively, even when no one would have noticed otherwise. Untrustworthy individuals, by contrast, often wait until they are caught, and even then, their apologies tend to focus more on minimizing consequences for themselves than on genuinely repairing harm caused to others. This single pattern, observed consistently across both personal relationships and professional environments, has been linked in psychological studies to lower levels of empathy and a higher likelihood of repeated dishonest behavior over time. The third behavior involves something deceptively simple: how a person treats those who have no power over them. Waiters, cleaning staff, junior employees, strangers who could never benefit or harm them in any meaningful way. Psychologists have long observed that character reveals itself most clearly in situations where there is nothing to gain from kindness. Someone who is warm and charming toward people who matter to their reputation, yet dismissive or rude toward those who do not, is displaying what researchers describe as strategic kindness, generosity calculated for social benefit rather than rooted in genuine respect for other human beings. This single pattern has quietly destroyed careers, relationships, and reputations, often only after years of being completely overlooked. The fourth behavior is excessive flattery delivered unusually early in a relationship. While genuine compliments build naturally as trust develops, manipulative individuals often front-load admiration before any real foundation of trust exists. Behavioral researchers studying influence tactics have found that excessive early flattery frequently serves a strategic purpose, lowering a person's natural defenses and creating rapid emotional investment before red flags have time to surface. This explains why so many people looking back on relationships that ended painfully recall a confusing whirlwind of admiration at the very beginning, one that left them emotionally invested long before they had any real evidence the admiration was genuine. The fifth behavior, subtle yet deeply revealing, is a consistent pattern of boundary testing. Untrustworthy individuals frequently probe the limits of what they can get away with through small, seemingly minor actions: showing up late without apology, borrowing something without asking, making a slightly inappropriate comment disguised as a joke.
Each instance alone might seem forgivable, but psychologists studying manipulation note that these moments often function as deliberate experiments, testing whether boundaries will be enforced or quietly absorbed. When no resistance appears, the boundary violations typically escalate, slowly and incrementally, until behavior that would have seemed shocking at the beginning eventually feels almost normal. The sixth behavior is something researchers call narrative inconsistency, small but noticeable contradictions in the details of stories told over time. A person might describe an event one way during one conversation, then unconsciously alter key details weeks later when retelling the same story. While occasional memory imperfection is normal for everyone, a consistent pattern of shifting details, particularly details that conveniently change to improve the storyteller's image or avoid blame, is a behavior strongly associated with habitual dishonesty. Trained investigators are taught to listen specifically for these inconsistencies, not because a single contradiction proves deception, but because a consistent pattern across multiple retellings very often does. The eighth behavior involves emotional weaponization, using someone else's compassion as a tool for personal gain. This often appears as exaggerated victimhood, consistently positioning oneself as wronged, misunderstood, or suffering in ways that conveniently excuse poor behavior or demand special treatment. Psychologists studying manipulation note that genuine vulnerability and strategic victimhood can look remarkably similar on the surface, but they differ in one critical way. Genuine vulnerability invites support without demanding specific behavior in return. Strategic victimhood, however, is almost always followed by an implicit or explicit request, sympathy that conveniently transforms into obligation. The eighth and final behavior is perhaps one of the most overlooked yet psychologically telling signs: how someone reacts to other people's success. Trustworthy individuals tend to express genuine, uncomplicated happiness when people around them succeed. Untrustworthy individuals often respond with subtle deflection, backhanded compliments, or an immediate redirection of conversation toward their own achievements. Psychologists studying envy and insecurity note that this reaction, though sometimes barely noticeable, reveals an underlying competitive insecurity that frequently translates into undermining behavior behind closed doors, even when public behavior appears supportive. The ninth and final behavior is one that ties every previous pattern together: a consistent gap between public persona and private behavior. Untrustworthy individuals often invest enormous energy maintaining an admirable public image, generous in front of others, agreeable in group settings, charming during first impressions, while behaving in starkly different ways when no one of social consequence is watching. This gap, researchers note, is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term untrustworthiness, because it reveals that the kindness being displayed is performative rather than authentic, carefully managed for audience approval rather than rooted in genuine internal values. When you look closely at these 9 behaviors together, an important pattern begins to emerge, one that should fundamentally change how you evaluate trust in your own life. None of these signs depend on a single dramatic moment of betrayal. Instead, they reveal themselves slowly through accumulated patterns over time, patterns that become invisible if you're only looking for obvious villainy rather than subtle inconsistency. This is precisely why so many people feel genuinely shocked when trusted individuals eventually betray them, not because warning signs were entirely absent, but because those signs were small enough, individually, to dismiss, explain away, or simply overlook. This raises a final, deeply important question worth sitting with. If trustworthiness reveals itself not through what people say, but through consistent patterns of behavior across time, especially in moments when no one of consequence is watching, how much of the trust we extend to others is based on genuine character, and how much is based on a carefully maintained performance we have simply never had reason to question? Perhaps the deepest insight here is not how to identify untrustworthy people in others, but how this same standard quietly applies to all of us. Trust, in the end, is never built through promises spoken in comfortable moments. It is built slowly and undeniably through actions repeated consistently, especially in the quiet, unwatched moments where character has nothing left to hide behind.